Emmett Cross was 41 years old when his wife handed him divorce papers at the kitchen table, smiled, and said, "You'll thank me for this." He drove a work truck with Cross Fabrication stenciled on the doors and a dent in the rear quarter panel he'd been meaning to hammer out for a year. He wore steel-toed boots to most occasions and had the hands of a man who had built things in every season. And Portia's colleagues at the hospital had always referred to him at gatherings as Portia's husband, the contractor, in a tone that made the word contractor carry the weight of an explanation rather than a title. Her friends thought she had settled. She had recently begun to agree. She had the papers prepared for 6 weeks before she served them. She set them on the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with the composure of someone who had rehearsed this scene until it ran clean. And she said, "You'll thank me for this." And she meant it completely, the way people mean things when they have done all their planning alone, in a room, without once asking what the other person actually knows. She had forged his signature on a refinancing document and pulled $89,000 in equity from their jointly held investment property, using the proceeds to fund a condominium purchased with a man named Brian Carver. What Portia had never asked, not once in 9 years of marriage, was a single detailed question about the company whose name was stenciled on the truck in their driveway. Not who it served, not what it built, not whose name was on the operating agreement filed with the state of Tennessee. She called his phone 44 times between the day she filed and the day she found out. He did not answer once. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The morning light came across the fabrication yard the same way it had come across it for 16 years. Low and particular, the kind of light that catches the edge of cut steel and makes it look briefly like something worth photographing. Emmett arrived at the yard at 5:45 on a Wednesday in August, 3 months before the papers arrived, and did what he did every morning: walked the floor, checked the overnight crew's work, ran his hand along a weld seam the way his grandfather had taught him to test for uniformity. His grandfather had built a 2-man welding shop in South Memphis in 1961 and grown it to 12 employees before he passed it to Emmett's father, who had grown it further before Emmett took it over at 29 and grew it into something his grandfather would have found difficult to picture. His grandfather's saying had been simple. "Steel doesn't ask for credit," he used to say, standing at the bench with his hood pushed back. "It just holds." Emmett had been holding things up quietly his entire life. Cross Fabrication and Construction had 140 employees, 3 active commercial projects across the Mid-South, and a contract proposal pending review with the Memphis Sports Authority for a new arena complex valued at $340 million. The operating agreement was filed with the state. The LLC predated his marriage to Portia by 4 years. His attorney, Claudette Marsh, had advised him at the time of the marriage to keep the business structure entirely separate from the marital estate, which he had done, which had felt like professional caution at the time and would later feel like something else entirely. To Portia, the company was the truck in the driveway and the work boots by the door, and a reason her husband was tired most evenings. She had never visited the yard. She had never asked to. She had made her assessment of it early and had not revisited the question. He came home at 6 that evening to the row house in East Memphis they had lived in for 7 years. A house he had gut-renovated himself over 2 summers, the kitchen tile he had laid by hand, the back deck he had built board by board from reclaimed cypress. Portia was in the living room, dressed to go out, phone in hand, her body already oriented toward the door in the way it had been for most of the year. "Late again," she said. It was not a question. "I'm on time," he said. She smiled in the way that meant she found the distinction unimportant. She kissed his cheek the way you touch a surface to confirm it is still there, and went out through the front door. He had met Portia at a church function in Germantown 8 years ago, before the marriage, and he had been drawn to her immediately. The precision of her sentences, the way she held opinions without needing to argue for them, the way she moved through a room as if she had already surveyed it. She had worked in hospital administration, and she was sharp at it, and he had admired that genuinely. She had seemed, in those early years, to admire what he did in return. She had sat with him once at a dinner table and asked him to explain how a steel structure was engineered, and he had talked for an hour and she had not looked away once. He had thought that attention meant she understood what he was. He had been wrong about what she was measuring. His second phone, registered under the LLC, managed through the business, was in his jacket pocket where it always was. Harold, His operations manager had left a message confirming the Sports Authority had requested a pre-submission meeting. The timeline was accelerating. Emmett sat at the kitchen table he had refinished himself and ate the dinner he had made himself, and looked at the chair where Portia had not sat. On a Friday evening in September, he opened the household account online to schedule a recurring payment and found a line item he did not recognize, a routing number he did not know. $11,000. He was very still for a long time. Then he went to his filing cabinet. He found the refinancing document on a Sunday morning. In the folder it should have been in, but placed at a slightly different angle. Someone had accessed the cabinet. Someone had replaced the document carefully, but not quite carefully enough. He had built things for 20 years. He knew when something had been touched. He set the document on the kitchen table and read it. His signature was on page 3. He looked at it for a long time. The particular angle of the letters, the pressure variation, the way the loop on the capital C was slightly too deliberate, slightly too constructed. He had signed his name approximately 40,000 times in his adult life. He knew exactly what it looked like. He moved with the same deliberate calm that had defined all his actions in every yard and boardroom and closing table he had ever sat at. He photographed page 3 with his phone. He photographed the routing slip attached to it. He photographed the filing cabinet from 3 angles. He pulled the bank statements for the investment property going back 18 months and found the refinancing draw, $89,000, disbursed in a single transfer 8 months ago to an account that was not joint, not business, not anything he recognized. He pulled property records online. A condominium in Midtown Memphis, purchased 9 months ago. Portia's name was not on the deed. A limited liability company he ran the LLC through the state filing system. The registered agent address matched the office of a man named Brian Carver, 43 hospital administrator, employed at the same healthcare system as Portia, listed in the same organizational directory on the same floor. She had not simply been leaving. She had been arriving somewhere else on his money. His hands did not shake. He forwarded the refinancing document and the bank records and the property filing to a private email address on a device she had never seen. He pulled 3 years of joint account statements and found a pattern of smaller transfers that preceded the refinancing. Exploratory amounts, he understood now, testing the routing before committing the larger sum. The total across all accounts, $97,400. What she had never thought to ask herself in 9 months of careful financial movement was whether the man she was taking from had spent 16 years building something whose entire structure predated her and placed it completely outside anything she could claim. He looked at the signature on page 3 one more time. At the deliberate loop of the C, he understood what it meant, not just as a legal matter, but as a statement about what she had believed. That he would not look closely, that a man who came home smelling of cut steel and spent his evenings too tired to ask questions was a man who could be taken from quietly and completely and would not know the shape of what had been removed. She had studied the wrong subject. He placed the document back in the folder, precisely where he had found it, in the slightly wrong position, exactly as he'd found it. He cooked dinner. When Portia came home, he asked about her day. She answered. They watched an hour of television. She went to bed. He sat at the kitchen table for another hour in the quiet that belonged to people who were intending something, and he opened a folder on his laptop and named it simply Tuesday. He already knew what day he would need it. Claudette Marsh had been practicing family and civil law in Memphis for 24 years, and she had a quality that Emmett had valued both times he'd retained her professionally. She did not perform concern. She processed information and told you what it meant. She reviewed the documents in silence, the refinancing signature, the account records, the property filing, the LLC trace, and when she finished, she removed her reading glasses and set them on the desk with the care of someone setting down something they do not want to misplace. The signature, she said. You're certain? I've signed my name 40,000 times, he said. That's not it. She wrote on a legal pad. We'll need a forensic document examiner to certify it. That converts this from a civil matter to a criminal referral. You understand the difference? I understand the difference, he said. She looked at him steadily. She filed for divorce expecting a standard equitable split. She does not know about the LLC structure predating the marriage, correct? Correct. And she does not know that the refinancing document constitutes forgery. She knows she did it, he said. She doesn't know I know. Claudette was quiet for a moment. Then she filed this with a great deal of confidence, she said, and no information. She gave him one sentence before he left. The filing was her first mistake, Claudette said. It triggered full financial disclosure, and financial disclosure is where we live. 3 days later, Emmett drove to his mother's house in Orange Mound on a Sunday afternoon. The way he had driven there every Sunday since his father passed 9 years ago. His mother, Etta Cross, was 68 years old and ran the administrative office at her church and had an understanding of human nature that she had earned the hard way and had never been shy about deploying. She poured him coffee without asking. She sat across from him and waited. He told her everything. She listened without moving. When he finished, she looked out the kitchen window for a while. She said you'd thank her, his mother said. Yes. Etta was quiet for another moment. Your grandfather used to say you find out what a structure is made of when the weight gets applied. She turned and looked at him with the directness of a woman who had raised him and knew every expression he owned. She applied the weight. Now you know what she's made of. The question is what you're going to build next. He drove back to Memphis with that sitting level and solid in him. A forensic document examiner named Charles Tatum worked out of a downtown Memphis office and had spent 20 years certifying question documents for courts, insurance companies, and district attorneys. He reviewed the refinancing signature against 6 verified exemplars of Emmett's authentic signature and produced a written report within 10 days. His conclusion was unambiguous. His language was the language of certainty, not probability. Claudette attached it to the filing without comment. Dennis Foote, a financial investigator she had used on complex cases for a decade, completed a full trace of the condo transaction and found that the $89,000 draw was not the only irregular transfer. An additional $8,400 had moved from a joint savings account in 3 installments 2 months before the refinancing, in what the pattern clearly indicated was a test of the routing pathway before committing the larger sum. The total documented financial misconduct came to $97,400. Portia had not been impulsive. She had been methodical. She had also, in the 6 months before filing, made 2 comments to hospital colleagues, documented in HR records following an unrelated internal complaint describing her husband as a small-time contractor with a mid-level business and no meaningful assets. Those statements were relevant. Claudette flagged them and added them to the file. Emmett went home every evening during those 3 weeks, and he was the man he always was, present, even-tempered, unhurried. He answered Portia's practical questions about the separation timeline without volunteering information in either direction. She seemed to read his quiet as confirmation of what she had always believed, that he did not fully understand his own situation. She had never been more wrong about anything in her life. On a Thursday evening, he sat at the kitchen table. His hands had refinished, and he thought about steel, about how the most load-bearing elements of any structure were always the ones you couldn't see from the street, the ones buried in the foundation or hidden inside the walls. Doing their work without announcement for years, he had been the load-bearing element of this marriage for 9 years. He had held things up quietly and without credit and without complaint. Now the weight was being applied in the other direction. He was not afraid of weight. She called for the first time on a Wednesday 12 days after the filing. He did not answer. She called again that evening. He did not answer. He did not answer on Thursday or Friday or the following Monday. He did not answer on the 7 occasions she called the following week, or the 11 occasions after that. He read each notification and set his phone face down and returned to what he was doing. By the time she sent a text asking why he wasn't responding, the count was at 31. He texted back 11 days after the first call, 1 sentence, an address on Union Avenue, a date, a time. She arrived at Claudette's office on a Tuesday morning in November, her attorney beside her, dressed and composed and certain that the silence had been grief and the meeting would be a negotiation she would control. She had her figures. She had her arguments. She had the particular confidence of someone who has never been corrected by the people they have underestimated. She walked into the conference room and did not immediately understand what she was looking at. Claudette was at the head of the table, Dennis Foote was to her left with a bound report and a laptop. Charles Tatum, the document examiner, sat beside Dennis with his certification report in a clear sleeve. Harold Emmett's operations manager of 11 years was present along the wall, not required. Simply there because he had been present at the founding of the company and Emmett had wanted someone in the room who knew the full shape of what had been built. Etta Cross sat in the near corner in a church cardigan with her hands folded in an expression that had seen more difficult Tuesdays than this one. Emmett was at the far end of the table in a clean shirt. He looked exactly like a man who drove a work truck with a dent in the rear quarter panel. Portia's attorney opened his folder. Claudette spoke first. She laid out the LLC operating agreement, dated 4 years before the marriage, placing the entirety of Cross Fabrication and Construction outside the divisible marital estate. She placed the current company valuation on the table, $28.4 million, certified by an independent firm retained 60 days prior. Portia's attorney stopped writing. Claudette continued. She presented Charles Tatum's document examination report, the refinancing signature on page 3, certified as not the authentic signature of Emmett Cross, with 6 comparison exemplars attached and annotated. She placed the bank record showing the $89,000 transfer and the preliminary $8,400 routing test. She placed Dennis Foote's complete trace totaling $97,400 in unauthorized transfers across 13 months. She placed the HR documentation from the hospital, 2 recorded statements by Portia describing her husband's business as mid-level and without meaningful assets. Relevant to the provisions of the separation agreement, Claudette had filed the prior week in response to the divorce petition. She slid copies down the table. Portia did not open hers. She was looking at Emmett. The forgery referral, Claudette said, completing her presentation in the same even tone she had used throughout, was forwarded to the Shelby County District Attorney's Office this morning. That is procedurally required once the examiner's certification is filed. It is not a decision made in this room today. It is the consequence of a decision made 9 months ago. The room was quiet. Portia's attorney leaned over and said something low. She did not respond to him. She looked at Emmett. "You knew," she said, "not as an accusation, as a recognition. When I handed you the papers," he looked at her with the steady, undecorated attention of a man who had spent his professional life reading the structural integrity of things other people had declared finished. "I knew what I built," he said. "I knew what you'd signed and what you hadn't. I knew what the filing would trigger." He paused once, the way he paused in any room when the next sentence was the only one that mattered. "You said I'd thank you for filing. I meant to tell you, I do. You filed first. Your filing triggered the full financial disclosure. The disclosure is how we found the refinancing document." He looked at her without anger, without satisfaction, without anything but perfect clarity. "So yes, Portia. Thank you." She opened her mouth. She closed it. "You had the truck figured out," he said. "You never asked what was in the yard." She did not move. Etta Cross said nothing at all from the corner. She did not need to. She simply watched her son stand up, button his clean shirt, collect his folder, and walk to the door with the unhurried certainty of a man who has applied load to a structure and confirmed exactly what it can hold. He did not look back. The 44th call came at 8:47 that evening from the parking deck outside Claudette's building. He looked at the screen. He put the phone in his pocket and drove home. 15 months passed, like a structure settling into sound ground. He was still in the East Memphis row house, which surprised people who expected him to leave, and which surprised no one who understood that a man who had laid the kitchen tile by hand and built the back deck board by board from reclaimed cypress was not likely to abandon something he had built simply because someone else had tried to take it. He had repainted the front room. He had built a raised garden bed along the south fence in April and planted tomatoes and hot peppers and one fig tree that had taken hold in the Memphis soil with the quiet determination of something that intended to stay. A woman named Dana had come into his life 8 months ago through a project introduction. A civil engineer with a local firm brought in as a subcontractor on the arena complex, who had arrived at their first site meeting with marked-up drawings and 2 direct questions that cut 20 minutes out of the agenda before anyone sat down. He had found that efficient, and then found it interesting, and then found himself somewhere around the fourth Tuesday meeting, looking forward to it in a way that had nothing to do with the agenda. She asked clear questions. She did not perform things for rooms. Cross Fabrication and Construction had been awarded the Memphis Sports Authority arena contract, $340 million, 18 months of primary steel fabrication and installation, the largest single contract in the company's 16-year history. Harold had framed the award letter and hung it in the main office. Emmett had told him he didn't need to do that. Harold had hung it anyway. The Shelby County District Attorney's Office had accepted the forgery referral and opened a formal investigation. Portia had retained criminal defense counsel in addition to her divorce attorney, which had consumed the settlement funds she had anticipated keeping. She had resigned from the hospital before the HR documentation became the subject of a broader internal review. She had moved to an apartment in a part of town she would not have considered a year ago. Brian Carver had sold the Midtown condo at a loss following the civil recovery judgment and had transferred to a hospital system in another state. Emmett had heard most of this from Claudette and from Harold, and from his mother, who kept him informed with the precision of a woman who believed that knowing the full picture was a form of self-respect. He had registered each piece and returned to work. He was not bitter. Bitterness required you to keep paying for something that was already finished, and he had spent enough on it already. He was sitting on the back deck he had built on a Sunday evening in October, the light going long and gold across the yard, Dana beside him, with something cold in her hand. The garden doing exactly what gardens do when you have given them enough time and enough care and the good sense to leave them alone to become what they were going to become. He was free. He was solvent. He was unbothered. Steel doesn't ask for credit. It just holds. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.